Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm grateful to David Hirsch and to everybody who participated in organizing this conference. So what I want to talk about today is anti-Zionism as a classic conspiracy theory. So the main point of my presentation and the main argument of my presentation is that much of the anti-Zionism that we encounter on the left today is a bona fide conspiracy theory. It derived from classic anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. It bears all the characteristics of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, and we need to understand it as such. We need to treat it as such because understanding it in these terms, really understanding it in these terms, will help us adopt better strategies for fighting against it. The strategies that we're using today, in my opinion, which are primarily to debunk on facts and based on logic, are not working. They're not wrong, they're correct, they're good strategies, but they're not enough. And they're not working because we're failing to see, acknowledge, and state clearly that what we're dealing with is grounded in conspiracy theory and represents anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. I'll make a disclaimer here, this is work in progress, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions and feedback. Okay, so as I continue, I want to put on a slide which some of you have seen me put on before, but I think it's a fascinating photo, so I love to start my presentations with it. What you see in this photo it's a photograph from a 1972 May Day parade in Moscow. So what you see in front of you is a parade float. There are children catching a ride on the parade. It's a lovely May Day. And you see, what are we seeing? We're seeing a spider with a big nose and a Star of David. And you might think that this is an anti-Semitic presentation because it might remind you of this presentation, which is a cover of the 1920s or so edition of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So it's a spider, in this case it's a communist spider, Bolshevik spider that's hugging the world and wants to kind of consume it and control it. But you would be wrong because this is not an anti-Semitic spider. This is actually, rather this is an anti-Zionist presentation. It's not an anti-Semitic presentation, it's an anti-Zionist presentation. How do we know it? We know it from the sign on the left, which says Zionism is a weapon of imperialism. So here's what I want to say. Here's where I want to start. So what I said about anti-Zionism being a conspiracy theory, how do I know this? I know it from, or the conclusion, I came to this conclusion from reading Soviet anti-Zionist literature, which I've spent the last 2 years doing at the National Library of Israel in Jerusalem. Not interpretations of that literature, not summaries of that literature, but that literature in the original. It's an extremely instructive experience. The Soviets actually had a thing called scientific anti-Zionism. They charged academic institutions with developing scientific critique of what they referred to as international Zionism. Of course, this critique was nothing but a confirmation of political and ideological perspectives. There was absolutely nothing scholarly about it. This literature is extremely formulaic, and in fact, I have a picture here. It's just a fraction of all the things that you can read about that. So it's very formulaic. It never questioned any of the ideas that it put forward. It repeated the same ideas over and over again. But because it wanted to look scientific, it was filled with footnotes. And so you can trace the origins of some of the ideas and tropes that it produced. You can see the same distortions, misquotes, and outright mistakes travel from one book to the next. You can see how the books create a system of circular references where it appears as though lots and lots of scholars come to the same conclusions, whereas in reality, you have a group of authors who all know each other, who all belong to the same circle, who are simply echoing each other over and over and over again and referencing each other over and over again. There was nothing authentic about it. There was nothing truly social justice or Marxist or revolutionary about it. It's all highly engineered. And it's produced by people who actually were part of a right-wing Russian nationalist movement, which was deeply anti-Semitic. I published some of the conclusions from these readings just recently in the Journal of Contemporary Anti-Semitism, and I want to thank Leslie Clough and David Hirsch who made it possible. The paper is titled Demonization Blueprints, Soviet Conspiracies, Anti-Zionism in Contemporary Left Discourse. And you can Google it, it's open access. I invite you to read it because today here I can only mention a couple of things from this paper. So number one, practically everything you hear in contemporary anti-Zionist discourse matches perfectly with the terminology used by Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda. It was Soviet propaganda that created and inculcated the associative links between Zionism and Nazi Germany, and fascism, colonialism, imperialism, racism, reaction, and apartheid. We'll see an example in a moment. Number two, the Soviets used multiple channels to communicate these ideas to the West. They did it through Soviet embassies, including their embassy in Washington, D.C. They did it through their massive propaganda apparatus that reached to over 100 countries and produced information in up to 100 languages. They did it through direct work with Western leftist parties, not just communist parties. They did it through direct investments and support for the left-wing press. Newspapers such as the Morning Star are one example of that. I'm often asked, the Soviet Union is now gone for 30 years. How can it be that Western left continues to be influenced by its ideas? And my answer to it is that the left got influenced by these ideas decades ago, in the 70s and 80s. And since then, the perspective has become the default position among portions of the left. So I want to show you a couple of examples of the terminology that we see in Soviet anti-Zionist literature. So here, for example, is a book titled Zionism as a Form of Racism and Racial Discrimination. In this book, and these are not huge books, these are pamphlet-sized books, maybe 120 pages or something like that. So the term occupation and occupier appears 139 times. Aggression, variations on aggression, 134 times. Racism, racist, 112 times. Terror, 99. Colonialism, 91. The last line is interesting. Variations on intelligence services, espionage, secret services, spying, 85 times. It was a very big line in Soviet propaganda that international Zionism relies on espionage networks and is part of espionage networks, etc. Here's another one, the ideology and practice of international Zionism. The word imperialism appears 158 times. Reaction, reactionary, 110. Racism, 107. Aggression, 93. Sabotage and subversion, 92. So these are, you see that there is a repetition of terms. This is just a snapshot. I mean, let me give you another example. Fascism under the Blue Star. This book made quite a splash when it first came out in 72 or 73 or something like that. It was produced by one of the most prolific Soviet anti-Zionist writers. So when we look at its terms, it drew a lot of attention in the West because it was truly anti-Semitic. What is the most frequent term that we see there? It's Jewish last names. So 236 times we see Rothschilds, Cohens, Lehmans. They're, of course, not Jews, they're Zionists. And here's a picture for you that he presents in the book. This is all that makes me think of David Miller's scheme, right? So the names that you have in these little squares are all Jewish names, but they're not Jews, they're Zionists. So why is he talking about them? Again, it's Rothschilds, it's Strausses, Abrahams, all of them. So look at the next term, bankers. So these rich Zionists own all the banks. They also own all of the manufacturing facilities in America and also in South Africa. And so he goes on and on about how these rich Zionists own everything in South Africa, and then they give donations to Israel. And so therefore, Israel supports South African apartheid. And here we have Africa here, 54 times. So we have, again, imperialist 67 times, aggression, reaction, et cetera, et cetera. So this goes on from book to book. It's a really depressing reading, but it's also fascinating in many ways. So, but it's not only the terms, okay? There are also concepts that appear and the explanatory logic that appear that we encounter today all the time. So I'll give you an example. Irrelevant and damning comparisons. We know that today everything is about Palestine, right? Every disaster and every war is like Palestine. Well, Soviet propaganda pioneered that. In the 70s, it was comparing Israeli actions against Arabs to American actions in Vietnam. Today, we have claims that are verging on blood libel, such as the idea that Israel harvests Palestinian children's organs. Soviet press claimed that Israeli military used napalm against civilian populations. Example number 2, explanatory logic with strong conspiracy themes. So Zionists and Israelis never do anything out of positive intentions or simply because it makes good sense. Everything always has a dark underbelly. So for an example, Israel doesn't just adopt progressive LGBTQ and environmental policies. It does so as a cover-up for its sinister action vis-a-vis the Palestinians, the famous pinkwashing and greenwashing argument. The Soviets did something similar. They claimed that there is no such thing as a Zionist who is a socialist. Zionists claim to be socialist in order to deceive public opinion, especially on the left. Soviets claimed that Israelis lied when they said they cared about Soviet Jews. What they wanted was cannon fodder for their wars. They argued that Zionists always accused their critics of anti-Semitism out of bad faith in order to smear their critics. I think a lot of it probably sounds familiar. So these arguments all betray conspiracist thinking, and we need to understand them as such. Now, how did they come up with these ideas? Here's where it gets really interesting. These ideas didn't come out of the blue. When you look at the biographies of the Soviet writers who produced this content, these people were called Zionologists, you can see very clearly that they were influenced by classic anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. So they didn't accidentally stumble into the tropes of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. They were reading the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. They were reading literature put out by the pre-revolutionary pogromist Black Hundreds movement. They were borrowing from that literature. It's documented. And they were also borrowing from Arab anti-Zionist propaganda and amplifying it. Some of the most prominent Zionologists were direct employees or were closely supervised by the KGB, by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, by the Central Committee of the Communist Party, by the ideological and propaganda departments. They worked in exclusive think tanks that serviced this ideological apparatus. And today we know that many, if not all of them, were confirmed anti-Semites. Again, you can find all of it in the paper that I mentioned. Okay, why is this important? It's important on a number of levels. First of all, once we understand this link between Soviet-style anti-Zionism and the Protocols-type anti-Semitism, we can understand the dangers of contemporary anti-Zionist discourse. We can understand that it is dangerous for Jews. Why? Let me show you a slide which, I put it together yesterday. I think next time I would do it a little bit better, but this will work. So you can see at the end, at the bottom, you have today's progressives, right, with all of their slogans. They inherit them essentially from the global left in the 1970s and 80s, which gets it from the Soviet propaganda, right, Soviet Zionologists. Now, where do Soviet Zionologists get their ideas? They get them from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. They read them from the Nazis because among them were people who worshipped the Nazis and really thought that they were right. So ultimately, today's anti-Zionist discourse contains, I would say, contains the DNA of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And I consider this to be very, very dark and very disturbing, especially when you consider that a lot of today's progressives are Jews. So the slogans that they are repeating come from a very, very dark source. So the Protocols, of course, are the most murderous piece of writing ever written. Noam Cohn called them a warrant for genocide. And today, these ideas, or sort of the descendants of these ideas, are being expressed on American campuses in the leftist progressive garb given to them by Soviet propaganda. So I think once you understand this, you begin to understand why this kind of rhetoric would lead to violence against Jews. Why did we have violence in American and European cities in May of 2021? Because anti-Semitic violence is inherent in contemporary anti-Zionist tropes, not metaphorically, literally. So the Soviets took the language of the protocol, they cleansed it of the most explicit right-wing anti-Semitism, they replaced Jews with Zionists, they made it conform to Marxist-Leninist formulations, and they sent it into the world. But the underlying fabric of anti-Semitic conspiracy remained. Okay, so what does it mean for our strategies for dealing with all of this? I think once we understand that we're dealing with conspiracy theory, we can turn to the body of work that deals with conspiracy theories in general. And so here I want to highlight a book called Conspiracy Theories by the British philosopher Qasim Qassam. I hope I'm not mispronouncing his name too much. His book is really interesting because he proposes to view conspiracy theories as a form of political propaganda. I find this to be a very helpful lens because if you think about anti-Zionist conspiracy theory as a form of political propaganda, you can ask the question of who benefits. You get out of this question of, is it anti-Semitic, is it not, who believes what, whose intentions are what. You then can look at it differently. Right? In Soviet times, participation in anti-Zionist propaganda boosted your career, showed you all the books. You got published, you got excellent reviews, you got honoraria, you might be rewarded with trips abroad. There were all kinds of reasons to participate in this exercise. Whether you believed in it or not, you participated in something that benefited you. Today, being an anti-Zionist also brings a lot of benefits. If you're a politician, it can help you get votes, it can help you fundraise, it can propel your political career, it can get you massive following in social media, it can get you gigs, it can get you published, it can get you promoted. at some point it becomes a grift that's hard to give up. And it doesn't matter, and here I'm sort of quoting Qasim Qassam, it doesn't matter if the person spreading these ideas, I'm paraphrasing him rather, it doesn't matter if the person who spreads these ideas believes in them or not. So Qassam makes the point that, let's say a person hangs a Confederate flag outside of their home, and she says that she's doing it because she wants to honor her Southern tradition, right? She's not doing it out of the racist, the kind of the racism that's implied in it. Mm-hmm. But she's still, through using that symbol, she's participating in communicating and spreading a particular set of values that are inherent in that flag. So even a person who doesn't fully understand that the anti-Zionist propaganda they spread, what it indicates, still participates in the spread of this propaganda and all of the meaning and historical baggage that it conveys. So, there's a complexity of incentives, right? For some people, it's an opportunity to be part of the community of the good. For some, as David Hirsch says it, for other people, it's a chance to make friends and be in a social circle they want to be a part of. So this complexity of incentives is what makes fighting anti-Zionist conspiracy theory so hard. So what to do? Again, I'm following here what Qassam says. There's other literature on the subject, but I'm particularly drawn to his model. So he argues, for example, that arguing with a committed conspiracy theorist is essentially a waste of time, especially in a case where there is a clear financial or ideological motive for promoting a particular conspiracy theory, in our case, anti-Zionism. The committed conspiracy theorist will not give it up. So he recommends that we address those who haven't yet become so fully personally committed to prevent them from going over to the dark side. So he proposes a three-pronged strategy, and this is the last thing I'm going to say. Rebut the conspiracy theory, yes, absolutely, wherever possible. Use arguments, use evidence, use facts, use logic to rebut it. Do it often, do it in a language that is accessible to the masses. I think this is really important for those of us who are academics here, right? Don't just stick to your academic lingo, but focus on people who have not yet really become fully committed, and understand that logic and factual rebuttals won't work on hardcore believers. Number two, he recommends education, equip people at an early stage with a critical thinking so that they can tell if they're seeing a conspiracy theory in front of them. I know it's easier said than done today, but we have to keep trying. And number three, and this I think is crucial, is outing. Make sure that people have a proper understanding that they're dealing with a conspiracy theory as propaganda and the causes that it promotes, and emphasize that the conspiracist anti-Zionism that we see today is linked to terrible history. It's linked to the most damaging and deadly right-wing thought. It's linked to a history of anti-Semitic oppression in the Soviet Union. It's linked to murder, right? It's linked to the protocols of the Elders of Zion. And I think this last part in particular opens a whole new strategy for us to deal with the conspiracist anti-Zionist rhetoric that we're seeing today. Thank you very much.